What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. Something important may be changing across several layers of the Russia-Ukraine war at the same time, and what makes today's briefing especially interesting is that the biggest stories are not all coming from one trench line or one strike map, but from the way military pressure, energy pressure, drone warfare, sanctions enforcement, and geopolitical bargaining are all starting to collide into one bigger picture. On one side, Volodymyr Zelensky is suddenly talking about an Eastern energy ceasefire, saying that Ukraine is ready for a halt in strikes on infrastructure and even ready to discuss a broader ceasefire covering the sea and the sky. On another side, a Ukrainian AN-196 drone carrying an unexploded warhead crashes in Finland near Kouvola, which Finnish authorities say marks the very first time this war has spilled into the Finnish soil. And above all of that, Zelensky is also saying Russia tried to use intelligence sharing with Iran as leverage against the United States, effectively exposing a threat. If America stops passing intelligence to Ukraine, Moscow would stop passing intelligence to Tehran. Putin, is literally ready to throw one of his closest and biggest allies under the bus. Meanwhile, Ukraine is still striking Russian systems in occupied Luhansk. France is still tightening pressure on a shadow fleet. A sanctioned Russian tanker is still heading towards Cuba. And the argument over whether Ukraine's drones are real innovation has now become its own political story. So the thesis for today's briefing is quite simple. This is no longer just a story about whether Russia advances near one village and Ukraine pushes back near another, because the war is now shaping a much wider contest over infrastructure, borders, oil routes, industrial credibility, and even the future military marketplace. The frontline still matters, of course, but the deeper story is that Ukraine is trying to turn battlefield adaptation into diplomatic leverage and technological legitimacy at the same time, while Russia is trying to turn oil, sanctions, loopholes on sanctions, and wider geopolitical chaos into a strategic breathing room. And once you see that bigger pattern, all 8 of those articles stop looking random and start looking like completely different parts of the very same machine. Here's where it gets interesting, because if you only look at the broad Russia narrative, the impression is always that the line is slowly bending in just one direction, and that time automatically just favors Moscow. But the actual details from today's battlefield stories are much more uneven than that. Deep State, for example, reported that Russian forces advanced near Pazina and Rusin Yar in Donetsk Oblast and near Varvarivka in Zaporizhia Oblast, which means pressure is still real and still distributed across multiple sectors. But at the same time, Ukrainian forces were conducting mop-up operations near Aristopol and Alexeyevka in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, which matters because mop-up operations tell you not simply that contact happened, but that Ukraine is still able to restore local control after Russian incursions or pressure. That already gives you a way more mixed picture than just the standard Russia grinds forward everywhere framing a narrative. And then you add the second tactical story, which is that the strike on a Russian all-weather, low to medium altitude, short-range surface-to-air missile system Tor in Luhansk Oblast. And suddenly, the operational meaning becomes much more important than the single vehicle itself. Ukraine's Unmanned Systems Force said that drone operators from the 9th Separate Brigade, working in coordination with the Deep Strike Center, hit this Tor vehicle, Tor machine equipment if you want to call it, while it was moving, with sources telling Ukrainskaya Pravda that the strike happened on March 29th. That is not just another battlefield clip or social media. A moving Tor is not a decorative object just sitting wide open in the field. It is a mobile air defense asset that exists precisely to shield forces and infrastructure from aerial threats. So when Ukraine damages a Tor on the move, it is not only removing one system, it is widening operational space for everything else that wants to fly, from reconnaissance to just even follow-up strikes. That is why the Ukrainian side framed it as weakening enemy's air defense on that front line specifically, and also giving the defense forces more room to operate. Then there is also a third detail here that most people skip too quickly, and that is that the reported strike in Samara Oblast and on the industrial enterprise in Tolyatti. According to the Independent's live reporting, Governor Vyacheslav Fedorishev confirmed a drone strike on an industrial site in Tolyatti, without obviously giving full detail on what exactly was hit or the scale of the damages. That matters because the pattern is familiar by now, right? Even when Russian regional authorities minimize specifics, the repeated acknowledgement of drone activity around industrial and infrastructure targets reinforces the same core message we have been talking about for months, which is that Ukraine keeps trying to move pressure away from symbolic targets and towards the machinery that sustains Russia's war effort and also economic resilience. So, what do these three stories mean together when they are placed together? They mean that just the map is not frozen. Russia is still pushing in places, but Ukraine is still disrupting the systems that allow those pushes to happen cleanly. That is a very different story from inevitable momentum. It is more unstable, more expensive, and way more revealing. And once you start from that point, next question almost asks itself. If drone pressure is now reaching air defenses, industrial nodes, and oil-linked infrastructure, what happens when one of those drones does not just stay where it was supposed to stay? That is exactly where the next chapter takes us. But first, guys, if you want to see some bonus content, such as uncensored combat footage from GoPros from Ukraine, please make sure to check our Patreon. The link is down below. These memberships are the best way to support our work here on YouTube. Thanks so much. Let's continue. Here's the surprising part. Sometimes one of the most important stories in a war is not the biggest strike, but the one that lands in the wrong place at the wrong time. Reuters reported that a Ukrainian drone that crashed in the southeastern Finland carried an unexploded warhead, according to preliminary assessment by Finnish police. Ukraine apologized, said that the drone was most likely went astray because of the Russian electronic interference, and there were no reported also injuries or damage. But the symbolic importance of the story is much bigger than the material damage, because this is described as the first time the Russian-Ukrainian war has spilled into Finnish soil. And the details matter here. Finnish police said that the drone came down north of Kouvola, identified as a Ukrainian AN-196 with a wingspan of 6.7 meters, and destroyed in a controlled detonation later on. Debris from a second drone, also thought to be Ukrainian, was found on Luhansk, east of Kouvola, and police were investigating whether it had detonated on impact. In other words, this was not a vague rumor or one confused sighting. It was an incident serious enough to trigger public briefings, also to trigger technical identification and disposal procedures. And once that happens in Finland, a NATO member with a very long border and a population already highly sensitive to Russian security risk, the story immediately stops being just about where a drone physically landed. It becomes a story about how modern war pressure leaks across space in ways that alliance structures were not designed for emotionally, even if they were designed for them legally and militarily. Now, to be very clear, this does not automatically mean some giant escalation is around the corner tomorrow morning. There is no evidence from that article that Finland is threatening this as an intentional Ukrainian strike on Finnish territory. The point is not exactly that, and in some ways more important. Once the war begins generating incidents on the territory of a NATO state, even accidentally, the mental map in Europe shifts. Viewers who thought this war was still something that happened over there, well, not even affecting them in any meaningful way, now those people have to process the fact that the spillover is no longer only economic or political. It can also be physical, technical, and immediate. And because Ukraine says Russian electronic warfare likely caused the drone to go astray, the incident also reinforces something else. Modern war is no longer just about where you launch from, but about what happens to signals, navigation, and control once systems are all in the air. At the same time, Reuters notes that Ukraine has stepped up drone attacks on Russian oil refineries and export routes in recent weeks, including some near Russia's border with Finland, as part of its efforts to weaken Moscow's war economy. That gives the Finland incident a second layer. It's not just a random aviation incident. It is linked to a campaign that is already strategically significant. And that campaign brings us straight to the next, much bigger battlefield behind the actual front lines, which is the energy. Now imagine this. At the same moment, Ukraine keeps pressing oil-linked targets and industrial nodes, Zelensky publicly says that Ukraine is ready for an energy ceasefire, ready even for an Eastern Holy so-called ceasefire, and ready for a broader arrangement in which neither missiles nor drones fly and there are no strikes on the infrastructure. If you only hear that on the surface, if you only hear the headline, it sounds contradictory. Why talk about an energy ceasefire now after building so much leverage through long-range strikes? But that is exactly why the story matters. Ukraine is signaling that it understands the value of what it has been hitting. You do not offer to stop doing something unless that something has become strategically meaningful. This is exactly where most people go wrong. They hear ceasefire proposal and assume just softness, fatigue, or diplomacy for diplomacy's sake. But a better way to look at it is the leverage management. If Ukraine has helped make energy infrastructure and export routes part of the real pressure equation, then offering to pose that pressure is not surrendering a card. It is proving that you hold one. Zelensky's wording matters here too. He did not speak only about a vague peace wish. He talked about food security and energy, the sea and the sky, in a condition where neither missiles nor drones fly. That is a very specific framing. It tells you Ukraine wants the infrastructure war recognized as one of the central negotiating theaters of the conflict, not as some side effect. And then, almost as if to prove why energy still decides everything, Reuters reported that Donald Trump signaled he was reversing course and blocking oil shipments to Cuba, saying that he had no problem with any country sending crude as a sanctioned Russian vessel from the Shadow Fleet near the Cuban port. Reuters said the tanker had sailed into Cuban waters and was expected to reach port on Monday, while Cuban President Miguel Diaz-Canel said that the country had not received imports for 3 months. The article also notes that Russia and Cuba both benefited from US easing of oil sanctions tied to the war in Iran. That means that the wider Middle East conflict is now feeding back into the global oil logistics in ways that can also indirectly help Russia. So while Ukraine is trying to raise the cost of Russian oil and also infrastructure vulnerability, the international system is simultaneously creating new openings elsewhere, because energy panic always rearranges priorities. That is one reason this war has become so difficult to isolate. Every time another regional crisis touches energy flows, Moscow gets a chance to breathe a little easier than it otherwise would. It does not raise sanctions, it does not raise Ukrainian strikes, but it does make the whole enforcement environment much more complicated. And that is why the France story matters more than it looks. Ukrainska Pravda, citing European Pravda and Le Figaro, reports that Chen Zhangzhe, the 39-year-old Chinese captain of the Russian Shadow Fleet tanker Boracay, seized by the French Navy off the coast of Brittany last year, was sentenced by a criminal court in Brest to 1 year in prison, fined 150,000 euros, and made subject to an arrest warrant. French authorities said that 244-meter vessel refused to comply when the Navy tried to inspect it in international waters near Ushant Island on September 27, 2025. And that the captain's hostility forced a very dangerous maneuver. Again, this is not just one legal case. It is Europe trying to prove that the Shadow Fleet is not some untouchable ghost network that can simply ignore state authority forever. So, in one chapter of the war, you have Ukraine offering an energy ceasefire from opposition shaped by strikes. Russia still benefiting from all dislocation caused by wider crises. Cuba showing how geopolitical loopholes appear under pressure, and then finally France trying to make an example out of Shadow Fleet case. That's not just 4 separate stories, that is one giant struggle over who gets to turn energy into leverage. And once energy becomes leverage, the next question is way too obvious. What kind of military technology made that leverage possible in the first place? That brings us to drones. Let's talk about now next chapter. Let me tell you a secret most people don't know, at least one about this war. When outsiders mock Ukraine's drone ecosystem, they are often revealing that they still do not understand what this war has become. Reuters reported that Ukrainians pushed back hard after Rheinmetall CEO Armin Papperger dismissed the country's drone-focused defense innovation as a work of quote-unquote housewives using 3D printers in kitchens. President Volodymyr Zelensky responded with a line that was both funny and devastating, saying that if every housewife in Ukraine can really make drones, then every housewife in Ukraine can be the CEO of Rheinmetall. Behind the joke is, however, a very serious point. For Kyiv, drones are not a hobbyist curiosity. Reuters says they have been critical to Ukraine's war effort and a source of national pride through 4+ years of fighting against a larger and better armed opponent. This story matters because Papperger's comments reflect a mindset that still exists in parts of the traditional defense world. Large firms built around tanks, artillery and heavy systems still tend to assume that industrial prestige flows from size, scale and steel. But Ukraine's battlefield experience has been teaching the opposite lesson over and over again. speed, maneuverability, decentralized production, and relentless adaptation can matter just as much as a mass. Reuters also noted that Papperger told The Atlantic that his company would continue focusing on heavy weaponry, including tanks and artillery systems, even as cheap drones increasingly prove capable of destroying them. That is a real debate, not a rhetorical one. Is the future of war built mainly by giant firms or by fast ecosystems that can innovate under pressure? That is the question. Ukraine, in this case, is arguing that the second model now deserves much more respect. And then there is a second layer to this chapter that connects directly to the wider geopolitical angle. Reuters reported on March 25th that Zelensky said Ukraine has irrefutable evidence that Russia is continuing to provide intelligence to Iran, that some Iranian drones used against the US military assets and allies contained Russian components, and that Ukraine is also helping Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Qatar, to counter those drone attacks on their territory. He also said he hopes for long-term deals with Gulf countries that could fund Ukrainian drone interceptors or at least help Ukraine receive badly needed air defense missiles. That means Ukraine's drone story is no longer just about survival on its own front lines. It is becoming an exportable security model. And just think about what it means. The same country that still relies on improvised workshop culture is now positioning itself as a practical advisor and potential supplier in one of the most urgent defense sectors in the world. That changes how audiences, allies, and even future customers will look at Ukraine. It is not simply the wounded party asking for help. It is also a laboratory of adaptation that other states may want to buy from, cooperate with, or learn from. And once that happens, the war is no longer only about territory. It becomes a competition over who will define the military lessons of the 21st century. But if Ukraine's drone ecosystem is becoming more valuable, that also raises the stakes around the next story. Because the valuable technology and valuable leverage attract bigger bargains, rougher pressure, and darker forms of diplomacy. That is where the unspeakable starts to happen. Let's talk about it in our final chapter. Here is the part that shocked me the most, because it tells you just how interconnected all these stories have become. Reuters reported that Zelensky said Putin wanted to blackmail the United States by offering to stop sharing military intelligence with Iran if Washington would stop sharing intelligence with Ukraine. Zelensky said Ukrainian intelligence once again had irrefutable evidence that Russia continued to provide intelligence to Iran, though he did not publicly provide any further details. He also said some Iranian drones used to attack US military assets and allies contained Russian components, like was spoken in the previous chapter. Whether you call this a bargain, a threat, or blackmail, the implication is absolutely the same. Moscow is trying to turn one war theater into leverage over another. And that is precisely why today's package of stories feels bigger than a normal daily briefing. When the war begins producing accidental spillover into Finland, legal and maritime pressure on the shadow fleet in France and Cuba, public disputes over who really owns the future of drone warfare, and reported intelligence bargaining around Iran and Ukraine, you're no longer just watching a single conflict that fits nearly inside every single map. You are watching a conflict that is rewriting how states think about coercion. Russia is trying to use oil, sanctions, evasions, and geopolitical linkages to widen its room for maneuver. Ukraine, on the other hand, is trying to use drones, infrastructure pressure, and diplomatic signaling to prove that it can still shape the strategic environment despite material disadvantages. And then outside players, from France to Finland to Gulf monarchies to the United States, are all being pulled deeper into this drama against their will. The escalation, in other words, is not just more violence, it is more now entanglement. More systems touching other systems, more fronts merging with markets, more electronics interfering with geography, more battlefield improvisation turning into export potential, more sanctions turning into navigation games, more diplomacy turning into bargaining over who helps whom in an entirely different war. And once the war reaches that stage, the old categories start breaking down. Battlefield update is thus no longer separate from economy. Economy, on the other hand, is no longer separate from diplomacy, and diplomacy in return is no longer separate from technology, especially from the military technology. That is why all these stories analyzed together matter even more. So guys, if you want more daily briefings that connect the battlefield, geopolitics, economy, sanctions, technology, diplomacy, and even domestic pressure inside Russia, Ukraine, or any other countries involved, and if you want to see all this into one coherent picture, please make sure to subscribe to this channel, like this video. Don't forget about Patreon, links down below. Thanks so much for watching, see you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe in ridiculous Russian propaganda.